Good morning. Welcome to the Henry George School for our annual conference, Existential Crisis. Is the George's Paradigm part of the solution? This year's conference has been co-organized with Fred Harrison, who, in addition to being the mastermind of the event, will be our keynote speaker. And Fred will be also the chair of two of the panels today. Allow me now to introduce our keynote speaker, Fred Harrison. Fred studied economics at Oxford, first at Ruskin College and then at University College, where he read philosophy, politics, and economics. Fred's first career was in newspaper journalism, most notably at the People's Newspaper, where he became chief reporter. After a move into economics, initially as director of the Center for Incentive Taxation, he spent 10 years in Russia advising the Duma, that's the Russian parliament, and local tax authorities on property tax reform and establishing land markets. Fred is currently the director of the London-based Land Research Trust. He is a worldwide celebrity on land reform and George's economics. So Fred, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ibrahima. Much obliged to you, and thank you to the Henry George School for facilitating this event, which I'm hoping will be the beginning of the rejuvenation of what Henry George created, which was a global reform movement, which has sustained itself through 5 generations. But I'm going to offer today what will sound like a pessimistic note, but I want it to be seen as the beginning of the renewal of the Georgist campaign, and I'll explain why it's very urgent that we begin to take action. Because here's the anomaly. For 300 years, one model of good governance has been articulated, which offered the benefits of an honest public revenue system, which was synchronized with efficient market economics. It's been thoroughly tested theoretically and put to the empirical test in countries like Denmark. No flaw has been identified other than objections based on self-interest. And yet, the philosophy has been systematically rejected. The outcome is a psychotic social system, which is visible in its most extreme form today in the United States. I should add here that I'm speaking only for myself and not on behalf of any organization. We cannot continue with this farce. Time is now of the essence, and I'll explain why briefly. I base my forecast on the future on the single fact that the Georgist fiscal paradigm is rejected in favor of pocketing the unearned gains from rent-yielding assets. Just the one single root cause. This creates a pricing system that systematically abuses people, it distorts their productive efforts, and it prejudices their relationship with natural habitats. The result has been 4,000 years in the making, but the past has now caught up with us. 4 existential crises now threaten humanity, not civilization, humanity itself. It's taken 4 millennia to reach this critical turning point. These crises have a single root cause: the revenue policies employed by all nations, capitalist and communist, the results of which are the environmental crisis, mass migration into Europe and North America, the trend towards autocracy, and what I call ideological paralysis. The pricing system dislocates relationships within and between communities, between societies and their natural environments. That is why the pricing system has to be reformed. I make this case as an urgent one based on timing. The end of the 18-year property cycle, which ends in 2028, will force the convergence of all four existential crises. Then there's the scale of the problem. Governments lack the tools to navigate through the multiple complex and destructive challenges. And then there's the ultimate obligation. We owe it to future generations to undertake the remedial action that is proportionate to the threats. I'm arguing that we cannot now prevent the collision of those four existential threats. An example relates to the peak in housing prices in 2026. This is a global phenomenon which will trigger collapse of the economies in general. And this time it won't be that the banks are too big to fail. This time it will be governments are too big to fail. But unlike in 2008, when the governments were able to bail out the bankers, no one is going to bail out governments. And that will create the systemic crisis that will force all the other three threats to converge into one huge collision, which in one of its manifestations will result in mass migration out of the global south into Europe and into North America. Later on, Franklin will explain that what we're seeing today with the mass migration is a trickle compared with what's going to happen over the next very few years. But already countries in Europe and North America say they're at their limits of coping with the in-migration, the forced migration. But this is only a trickle compared with what is going to happen. As a result of the collision of the existential crises, more governments will seek refuge in military conflicts. People will turn to the autocrats, and I don't need to name some of the obvious ones, and that will lead to nations combining in military conflicts. Because of the financial strains that all of this will cause, the attempts, and they're only symbolic, frankly, at the present time, to cope with the eco-crisis will be abandoned. The costs of the net zero programs will fall by the wayside, so no effort will be made to try and cope with the eco-crisis. So what can we do about this? Well, in my view, it's too late to actually, or rather, it's premature to talk about specific strategies. We need those strategies, but before we can articulate them in terms that the general public can understand and empathize with them, we need a conversation, a global conversation that will enable people to define what they want out of the future, out of life. That conversation needs to explore the scope of the action that needs to be taken to navigate the colliding crises. And there needs to be an acceptance of personal responsibility for achieving the common good. My challenge to the global Georgist movement, therefore, is this. The Georgist paradigm is actually the only doctrine capable of mobilizing people on a sufficient scale to address the issues that will be imposing themselves on us within the time of the present newly elected governments. That's within 5 years. These issues need to be addressed within that short timetable. This imposes a huge existential burden on the Georgist movement because there is no alternative paradigm that can help people on an individual and a national basis, let alone a global one, to scope out strategies for survival and charting a way through the collision of the 4 existential crises to the calmer waters, whatever they may be, at the other end of this horrendous period that now looms. None of the existing philosophies that are preached by academics and policymakers can provide what it would take to control these looming events once the existing existential crises have collided, which will unleash the destructive power of the kind that we have never seen in history. The only comparable periods in the past with what is now going to happen occurred in the ancient civilizations and in the classical civilizations. But in those periods, while the civilizations were forced into collapse, humanity wasn't a threat, because even though the Mesopotamian civilizations did collapse, people could move on. They could stick with what they've got, that what are called the Dark Ages, or move to new virgin territories and start to rebuild society. We do not have that choice. So, for example, with the migration threats, these threats happened in antiquity. The migrants sailed down the Mediterranean from the west. They were called the boat people. They are still regarded as mysterious people. They flooded into Egypt and Mesopotamia, and that inaugurated the collapse of those civilizations. Then in the classical period, the barbarians, as the Romans called them, came from the north. They came on horseback. And they flooded in and took over the western half of the Roman civilization. But these migrants weren't the cause of the collapse of civilizations. They just found it very easy to move into the territorial spaces because prior to their arrival, those civilizations in antiquity and classical times were depleted. They lost their vitality for one reason only. The net income which people produce to fund the well-being of themselves and their communities was diverted from the social purpose into private use. And so we are repeating that tragedy, but we do not have the option of moving to virgin territories elsewhere in the world, because the whole of the globe is now a single system. I call it a single civilization, being fully aware that there's a difference between China and America, one capitalist, one communist, but they have the one fatal thing in common. They allow the rents of their societies to be privatized. And that's the root cause of the destruction that originates internally and allows the external influences to impose themselves to devastating effect. So it's urgent, it's existential, and I'm afraid that only the Georgists have the model that can help us to navigate that crisis, which means that each and every one of us has an obligation to do our best to visualize what could happen, how we might begin to construct strategies to minimize the damage and help to navigate through into the future. I think I'm going to stop there because I'm the first speaker in the first panel, so I can continue with more detail in that panel. So Ibrahima, if you could take over from here.
Thank you very much, Fred, for this fantastic introduction. We are going to move now to our first panel, the 4 existential crises threatening humanity. So I have already introduced Fred, so I will just go ahead and introduce the second panelist, Dr. Franklin Obeng-Odom. Dr. Franklin is a professor of global development studies at the University of Helsinki in Finland. He is a fellow of the Teachers Academy, the highest recognition bestowed on distinguished teachers at the university. He is also a winner of the Deborah Gurney Innovative Teaching Award for effective pedagogy that engages students with issues of war, peace, identity, sovereignty, security, sustainability. He previously taught at various universities in Australia. His research interests are centered on the political economy of development, stratification economics, urban and regional economics, natural resources. He has published 6 books, including Global Migration Beyond Limits, The Commons in an Age of Uncertainty, and Property, Institutions, and Social Stratification in Africa. Professor Odom is a fellow at the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, the oldest learned national society in post-colonial Africa, and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, an assembly of the world's leading social scientists. Professor Obeng-Odom is today connecting from Bali, Indonesia. And now I'm gonna just pass it over to the panelists. Who is gonna go first, Fred or Professor Franklin?
I'll go first because it's a logical sequence.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay. So I've laid out what I believe are the 4 existential threats. It's taken 300 years for Europe and North America's influence to prevail to bring about this horrendous prospect that I've outlined. The mystery is that the 5 generations of Georgist activists who have worked since Henry George published his book have campaigned with no real substantial success. Yes, there was a success in Denmark. Yes, we can point to the adoption of the direct collection of rental revenue in Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand. But as we will learn later from people like Brian Kavanagh, these successes are qualified and they're in retreat. So, responsibility for this failure over the past 300 years, ever since the French physiocrats and Adam Smith began to elaborate the sensible way to raise revenue to pay for public services, the responsibility lies with the culture that emerged, re-emerged to consolidate what economists call free riding, consolidated that behavior into a culture, the culture that now controls not just Europe, not just America, it's now a global disease. activists within the Georgist movement over these 5 generations, and that includes me, have allowed ourselves to be lured into employing tactics which amount to shooting ourselves in the foot. I will explain what I mean by that. But it's important, imperative that we now redefine the agenda for the next generation of activists by drawing on the lessons of failure from the past. We cannot allow young people like myself 50 years ago to be integrated into the Georgist movement, reusing the same kind of language and tactics that the previous 4 generations had employed. There has to be a departure, and we have to explore what that means. And I'm maintaining that there is almost no time in which to undertake this exercise because of the end of the current 18-year cycle, in which the current trends, frankly, are irreversible. Given that the Georgist paradigm is the only one that is capable of guiding humanity through the worst of what will happen, the burden falls on us to present a strategy that gives people, assuming they've come to understand what we're talking about, the hope that they can navigate through the crises. It's so imperative that hope comes to the fore rather than the desperation that causes chaos and leads to terrible consequences. The first task for the reform agenda is to overcome the linguistic barriers. I accept that this will not be easy for the Georgist activists and organizations, because we've been using the same language for 5 generations. Over that century, we have used the words land value taxation, advocated because it is fair and efficient. It's almost with every second breath we advocate land value taxation because it is fair and efficient. This language needs to be revised if we are to attract the empathies of what has to be turned into a global, a mass movement of the kind that Henry George succeeded in creating beginning in the late 19th century. The reality is this: we are not advocating a tax. Taxes are immoral. They appropriate personal property. Taxes are arbitrary as to tax rates and levies on earned income, and they are discriminatory. They privilege the owners of rent-yielding assets, and in the process, they prejudice the lives of others. The owners of rent-yielding assets reject the concept of a land value tax, and with good reason. A tax is psychologically off-putting. No one likes to pay taxes, so people switch off when you talk to them about a land value tax. Oh no, not another tax, they say, and they're not interested in discussing the detail. The description is factually incorrect in the main. The charge that we are talking about falls almost wholly on the value created by social, not natural, services. Land refers to nature, all of nature. And the land value tax concept reinforces the status quo. Land value accepts rent in its capitalized form and therefore accepts existing property rights. When you go through all those considerations, it's not surprising that people switch off and walk away, don't want to know anymore. New fiscal concepts should emphasize that people are paying the price at the point when and where they benefit from usually social services. We all create those social services. They are not gifted free by nature. So how dare anyone claim proprietorial rights over those public services or the net benefits which they generate? In contrast, when rent is pooled in the public purse, payments are imperative. How else can we fund services we say we want to share in common? They are proportionate. Sums paid reflect the value of the benefits received. And they are egalitarian. People choose the benefits they want, so there is no arbitrary discrimination between citizens. We need to assemble a complete catalogue of consequences rooted in the existing system for funding public services. One of these is the life and death issue, which I'll refer to shortly. By following the money under the current financial system, we find that the contrast in life expectancy is rooted in the way the nation's income is sliced and diced in favor of those who own rent-yielding assets. I'll offer you two examples. Take the case from Boston. We have just learnt that the residents in an area called Back Bay live on average 23 years longer, 23 years longer at the end of their lives than those who live in the nearby area called Nubian Square, in an area called Roxbury. That's the official statistical report that's just been released. 25 years on average difference in life. Of course, the experts don't want to burrow too deep into the causes, and they shift the responsibility onto in this case, the African Americans who happen to populate the areas where life expectancy is 23 years less than the neighbors, the white people who live in the wealthy area called Back Bay. Here in England, in Blackpool, which is a coastal seaside town, the life expectancy of people born into a number of the districts of that city is 12 years less than people born in the London borough where I live. 12 years. Imagine it. Mothers in hospital giving birth to their babies in Blackpool could be told by their surgeons, oh, by the way, you do know that your baby is going to live on average 12 fewer years than if you had given birth to your child living down in London in certain boroughs. 12 years. That's only half the difference of the example I've given you in Boston. This is an outrage, and it needs to be traced back to the source. And we, as Georgist analysts, are the only ones capable of following the money from the source of the problem to the manifestations, the ripple effects, as I call it, that surface in all our lives today. This means we need a new form of governance as well as economics. But first things first, we need a substantial conversation and introspection, both at the personal and the communal levels. We need to work through all the implications, beginning with the language that we use, and then to trace the ripple effects as these trigger through all our lives. To come to terms with the need to redefine property rights and the way that we fund the services we want to share in common. So before we can scope out strategies for navigating the existential threats that now loom, we need to come to terms with the nature and scale of the challenges and the way we can present the origins of the problem to the public and a global audience, so that we can only hope that if we can generate the empathies of enough people, we create a global mass movement for change. That is the only way that governments will be forced to listen. Right, I've concluded my introduction, and I'm happy to hand over to Franklin.
Many thanks, Fred. What Fred Harrison has outlined, a global crisis of the commons. They characterize the period which Mark Twain and Charles Warner called the Gilded Age. A global epoch, it reflected and projected uneven and unequal power. In our own time, these inequalities have become interlinked, metastasizing into existential emergencies. In Harrison's telling, these are ecological disruption, migration displacement, autocratic opportunism, and ideological paralysis that inhibits our analysis and action. In supporting Harrison's contribution, I'll try to illustrate his point with other examples, highlight what I consider particularly promising avenues for further work, and draw attention to possible ideological paralysis in George's analysis too. Some George's spaces appear to be entertaining climate denialism, foregrounded in what I consider to be a problematic criterion, proof beyond reasonable doubt. The test of the reality of ecological crisis, I suggest, is the preponderance of the evidence. Using this basis, the IPCC estimates that there is more than a 50% chance that global warming will reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius in the near term. Questions could be asked about how best to pursue mitigation and adaptation, of course. As fundamentally still, the analysis of ecological disruption could be far more historical, more truly global, and more fully centered on land. Doing so is critical, partly because it could shift the focus away from behavioral and anthropocentric emphasis to institutional and multi-species concerns, and particularly because it will show the link between climate change and climate refugees. Over the next 30 years, climate change will displace more than 140 million people. A vast number of these climate refugees are Black people who are at a higher risk because of what Eric Williams once called capitalism and slavery. The Industrial Revolution, largely financed by slavery, developed the global North, underdeveloped the global South, and bequeathed what Naomi Klein calls sacrifice zones to particular people in Africa, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. Western flora and fauna destroyed southern biodiversity during colonialism, what Andrew Crosby has detailed in his book, Ecological Imperialism. Today, fossil-based capitalism has worsened the problem with transnational corporations displacing people and destroying their habitats, both in the global north and in the global south. David White's book, Ecocide, documents the enormity of the problem in the UK and in Europe. Black South African scholars are correct to label this dynamic ecological apartheid. In their book, From Here to Equality, Darity and Mullen note about the US, quote, Blacks are likelier than whites to live in communities located near hazardous waste sites and to suffer from nitrogen dioxide exposure, and more likely to lack potable water and sanitation, unquote. Building walls, forcibly turning back migrant boats, giving development aid to help keep migrants in their place, and processing migrant application for refugee status in poorer nations are rather questionable policies in the light of these realities. Climate refugees are not in the West to steal jobs or commit crimes or take advantage of anyone. The so-called Great Replacement theory is a fallacy. Only some 27% of migrants are international. Only 18% of migrants from Africa live in Europe. 70% live in other African countries. And of the total population of African migrants in Africa, 90% plan to remain on the continent. Thinking of global migration in national or regional terms is clearly an upside-down view of the world. Georges could help refocus the public discussion about ecological disruption on global land rent. It is indeed quite fundamental to the crisis of climate and other types of migration. It also intersects with autocratic opportunism. Great power war, according to George's scholarship, will be attenuated by what Henry George called true free trade. This cannot be effectively analyzed without probing the ecological consequences of war. 42 million tons of carbon dioxide were released into the atmosphere only 10 months after Russia's war on Ukraine. So, discussing various explanations of and possible solutions to the war is an urgent task. Existing attempts stress culture, but is the culture of war a sufficient explanation? Could we also consider Michael Ross's resource wars interpretation? If so, could a different political economy of land create the conditions for peace? Harrison compellingly argues that Georgism would help to answer some questions about war and reconstruction in a recent paper. Where Georges need to probe further is the discussion about identities, power, and reparations. One way, as I have suggested, is to consider ecological, migration, and security problems as crises of the commons. A complementary strategy is to emphasize rents, identities, and reparations, and how they intersect. Of these, Georgists are comfortable with rent, but remain relatively silent or even dismissive of the other two, especially reparations. But in social problems, Henry George clearly states that, and I quote, such a measure would have given the freed man a fairer start, unquote. Neglecting a fairer start is reproduced in the original version of the Monopoly game by Elizabeth Magie too, because much like the rules that govern the pirated version of the Landlord's game today, in Magie's Landlord's game, players start with the same amount of cash. Unfortunately, in the real world, that is not the case. We start with unequal resources. How this came to be and why this foundational inequality reproduces itself as crisis of the commons must become more central to Georgia's political economy if we are to avoid what Harrison calls the ideological paralysis that inhibits our analysis and action. Fred Harrison has set a timely agenda, and following Henry George, I ask not veneration of the form, but recognition of the spirit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Franklin, for this beautiful presentation, basically breaking down the 4 existential crises and creating links between them. Before I hand it over to the public, because I think we have another 15 minutes for the Q&A, I just wanted to ask a few questions, actually one. Of all the 4 crises that you've listed, if we were to give a priority in terms of addressing them, which one do you think is the most important? So that by addressing it, most likely the other 3 would be taken care of.
Shall I offer an answer
Of
first?
course.
Okay. Look, they are all of these threats are rooted in one cause. The one cause is the pricing system that causes us to misappropriate the natural world, which causes distortions in the productive process, which causes the distrust of politicians who keep failing to keep their promises, leading to autocracy, which then has implications for the military consequences. And in order to sustain this ridiculous situation, the culture of cheating, as I call it, had to create a form of language for us to actually believe in, to communicate through, which leads us to constantly repeating the errors of the past. So, for instance, we've now just elected here in Britain a government that says it will now go for growth and will solve the housing problem. But they offer no program that will enable them to boost growth above historical levels or to increase the output of housing. So they will just end up causing further unhappiness among the public. So there is no one element of the 4 issues that I've identified as more important, because they're all rooted in the same cause. And we can't tackle one or the other of these problems without tackling the cause. And if we tackle the cause, we will simultaneously begin to address all of the existential threats.
Thank you very much, Fred. Franklin, do you have something to add, or you are satisfied with what Fred said?
I agree with Fred Harrison that all these crises are not only interconnected, but also rooted in one problem, the private appropriation of socially created value. But as a matter of strategy, I would prioritize the ecological crisis on the basis that it is sufficiently global to bring the whole world to at least to the table. It is also sufficiently present and sufficiently existential. So starting with that problem and never ending with it, but at least starting with it or framing this as in response to your question, if we had to prioritize, could bring the world closer together to seek a solution than the others. But I agree that all these are in fact symptoms of one central problem.
Great. Thank you very much.